Before we start, we're not taping, are we? Oh. All right, we need to go ahead and get started. Let me say a couple things. We have to meet in the sanctuary. Now, we're on live anyway, but we have to meet in the sanctuary because of our situation. In other words, we can't move technology and everything else to another room and keep it clean. But it is very hard to do anything in here with people that are sitting behind the columns. So just know that. I'm not going to come back and get you, but it's very hard to do teaching with everybody back there. So I'm not going to say anything else. I'm not going to mention names, but it's hard enough doing what we're doing, having a mask on, and then being a football field away. So, all right, we have the passage from Sunday, and all those that are tuning in, pardon my my announcements to the congregation that are here that I can't see because they're so far back, but we are going to look at our outline, and that's available to you online. And it is one of those really good passages that is found in Matthew 14. And we're going to take it apart and hopefully put it back together. Part of the difficulty in what Wednesdays used to be was a very intimate setting where we could talk back and forth, but obviously it's very hard to do that when you got a mask on. So I don't have one, so I can project and hopefully we can make it through, plus I have a microphone. So, Matthew 14, and by the way, I'll go ahead and give you a heads up. We shift about 15 minutes or so from now, 15 to 20, and then go into our prayer time, and so that will be coming up here in just a minute. And we will shift over to Facebook Live with our membership possibility. So, if you are on our membership page, then you can get into that, and that's where we'll talk about some of the other things on our minds regarding folks on our prayer list. So, we talked Sunday, we called it the real story because we are looking at a passage that's very, very popular in that it is popular from the standpoint of all the Gospels have it included. And so when you do that, you know immediately that there's something important about this passage. And so I didn't talk much Sunday about the background, but there's two really Old Testament passages that are kind of undergirding this passage. And one of them is Elisha, where he was feeding. It was a feeding miracle, and you'll see it in 2 Kings 4. He had 20 barley loaves to feed 100 people. So you've kind of got that little story in the background. The other one is, of course, one that's a little bit more familiar, and that is the story of the manna in the wilderness, where the bread, came. They were able to utilize it for a short period of time, but you either, use it or lose it kinds of things. So, Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 and 14, Jesus had compassion. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place apart. Now, kind of notice what's happening there. What had Jesus heard of? Well, if you go back a little bit, you find out that he had heard about the death of John the Baptist. Now, why could that have been very traumatic for him? Well, because, John the Baptist was important to him. He had baptized him. It wasn't a sin issue for Jesus, but it was a declaration of his ministry issue. And so what are the things that it could have, and I listed several of them there for you. It could be fear. In other words, the writers said, well, maybe there was some fear in all of this, and that the word there, withdrawal, occurs 5 times in previous chapters, and all of those were a response to fear. And yet, do you believe for one moment that Jesus was fearful? That was not a natural characteristic of who Jesus was. So chances are there was really no reason for Jesus to be fearful. The second one, it could be timing. On occasion, Jesus chose not to go to Jerusalem. Why? Because it was not, quote, the time, and it was his time had not yet come. There were other references in the Gospels to Jesus saying, this isn't the right time. And think about in your own life, and doing something, sometimes everything else is right to do something except the timing. And so how important is it to have the timing? Well, it's incredibly important. So it could be the timing. The third reason, and the one that I referenced a moment ago, is it could be grief at John's death. And so if you feel compassion, which he did for the crowds, then obviously he can also feel compassion for the death of his friends. Think back in your own life about moments when there is just a kind of haze that settles in on you. We've recently had 2 or 3 deaths in our church, and think back about what that does to you. It's kind of a reminder that life, we only have one day at a time, and it's a reminder that we are connected. And whenever we lose one of the links in our friendships and those kinds of things, then something obviously happens to us. Verse 13b is, when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. So how frustrating to need to be alone and then to be denied about it. If I were to do a test tonight, how many of you enjoy being with people, and how many of you enjoy being alone, just naturally? Not that, chances are it would be about half and half in the room. I could almost go around and look at you and tell you, which, I've known most of you well enough that I could tell you which you have a leaning toward. And I've mentioned before that my personality profile clearly makes me an introvert. I'm not an extreme introvert, but I have that leaning in that direction. So my natural inclination is I enjoy being alone. Obviously, as a pastor, I have had to adapt toward just engaging with people a little more. Fortunately, I obviously get a natural draw from that because I'm married to an extreme extrovert, and so she certainly draws that out of me. But the tension that you feel, have you ever been, if you're an extrovert, have you ever been in a situation where you haven't been able to be with people, and how that drains you? And then vice versa, have you ever been an introvert and you've wanted to be away from people, and how it drains you when you're not able to do it? Either way, there are some instances that give you energy. There are some instances that drain your energy. And so for me, at least, think about Jesus. I mean, he had gone through the grief of a loss of a friend and a leader, John the Baptist. He felt the need to pull away, and what did they do? They followed him there, and sure enough, he felt that. So in verse 14 there, it says, Jesus went out, and he saw a great multitude. He had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. In other words, he went back to work. He went back to caring for people. He went back to healing people. He went back to investing. And so the question I ask there is this: just as Jesus felt compassion for the crowds in verse 4, the disciples also feel compassion in verse 5. They are surely hungry themselves and can imagine the misery that awaits the crowd unless someone takes action. You ever been sitting around a group and everything's going well and there's chatter back and forth and everybody's just kind of connecting and enjoying themselves, and then somebody says, no, we got to stop this and we got to go get something to eat, we got to go do, and how there's a resistance to that until, of course, you reach the point where you're really, really hungry. And so I would simply remind you that hungry people are very difficult. It starts with children. If you are hungry, listen to a parent sometime. The two things that a parent will say about their child when they're causing difficulty is what? Well, they're hungry, or they're what? Tired. That's right, hungry or tired. And if they're not one of those two, then they're likely to be really in trouble. So, Verse 15, B and C there. This place is deserted, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food. In other words, listen, I'm the practical one here. How many of you are the practical one? You're the doers. When something happens, you get up and you get it done. And so that's basically what's going on here. They assume that Jesus is so caught up into the ministry of this moment, which he may have been, that he had failed to notice that, in fact, it was getting late. And so things were going on. And so they wanted to kind of push Jesus out of the spiritual world back into the physical world. Listen, we got some hunger going on here, and we need to take care of it. Again, which one are you? Which leaning do you have? I mean, most naturally, I'm a practical guy, get things done, take care of the family. But, my calling is spiritual. And so there's always this challenge about balancing that for the right reasons. Verse 16, they don't need to go away. Think about that. They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And the word you here is a kind of emphatic. I'm going to need you to be involved in taking care of them. You give them something to eat. So the obedience here of the disciples is important because it's going to be a part of the miracle. And so just as our obedience is important. Now, I'm going to kind of earmark that Sunday. It looks like I'm going to be dealing with a passage, Genesis 35, where we're going to talk in there about obedience and how incredibly important that is. But let's look at the question that I asked. Christ takes our contribution, however modest, and makes it enough. You give them something to eat continues to challenge Christians. We live in a world full of hungry people, and pray that Jesus might do something. He responds, you give them something to eat. And the church has often risen to the challenge, providing food, clothing, shelter, and medical care to people in the far corners of the world. How can we do more? Well, I'm very encouraged by our congregation whenever we put out a plea for somebody that we have a need, and that we initially we were investing a lot in folks, just a lot of hunger issues when we first started the pandemic. That has leveled off. All that goes in cycles. I would be surprised if it doesn't pick up again here pretty soon. But today, for instance, two people we dealt with, two different kind of groups of people really, and both of them have some level of housing. Now, on Monday, I dealt with a homeless person. Really, it was over the weekend. And I would just pause to say that usually we always have enough resources to provide for folks. Today, we were able to give some Kroger cards to people. I was able to give some work for somebody to do some work here at the church, and we paid them for working around here. I like to be able to do that. They need to work, and we needed the work done, so it worked out really, really well. I say all that to say I'm pretty pleased at the fact that even though our folks are spread out all over, we feel so strange and we feel so strained in terms of being able to be together. For the most part, our folks have been responding very, very positively. And so let me just say to those who are watching by way of Facebook or YouTube, and you're in this congregation and you give, particularly we think about giving after we do our Lord's Supper, but our giving is so different now. We don't give it out in our plates. We don't have a special time where we handle the money in the back. Everything goes into those little cash things at the back of the church for just little boxes for you. And on those Sundays, if it's cash in there, we typically use that just for benevolence unless somebody marks it differently. But today, just think about that. We were able to give out three of the Kroger cards and provide work for somebody. And the homeless person, I got connected through, got something I'm going to say about that later, but I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. Disciples respond, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, verse 17. The disciples emphasize not what they have, but what they do not have. How human is that? It's incredibly human. We have, look at the glass half empty, not the glass half full. So look at the question. We are tempted to believe, as the disciples did, that we have nothing to offer in the face of overwhelming need. One problem with that approach is practical. We just don't feel like we do have something. We kind of undershoot our potential. The other one is theological. In whom do we really trust? Where do we really believe that our power lies? Now, here's the tension. The tension between there's a certain power in our weakness. There's a certain power in knowing that we can't get it all done, do it all. There's a certain power in that. Paul talks about it over and over again. There is a power in weakness. So that there is that humility side of it. But the other side is what Grady Nutt used to say when he said, God don't make no junk. Double negative emphasis. God don't make no junk. And what he's doing is saying God makes us valuable. We are worthy. We are his creation. And so what you understand is that God has made me, and I get to participate in the kingdom of God, and that makes me very useful. Verses 18 through 21, were ate and were filled. Bring them here to me. There's that verse 18. In the disciples' hands, 5 loaves, 2 fish are not much, but there the other hands, Jesus' hands. Take folks to Jesus. Basically, that's what that passage is saying. Take folks to Jesus. What is it that you did today when you encountered people that they might sense, hey, I really want them to see Jesus more than I want them to see me, and how that might play out in their life. So the question I put there is, this is an important word for the church today. Most churches struggle to keep the doors open. Do you realize that I talked with our associational missionary the other day, and he says, Dan, probably of the 70 churches, we will lose 3 or 4 churches during this pandemic. They literally will have to close their doors, and how that plays out is really, really concerning to me. So how can we expect to do anything meaningful to relieve poverty? We've talked about that. That's what I wanted to reference here. The homelessness or any number of horrendous problems, Jesus says, bring them here to me. So what are we doing to do that? I listed some folks. You may not know this, but Dr. Snyder, who's in our congregation, been in our congregation for a long time, is a psychiatrist, and he regularly talks and encourages people, not only in his care, but in his life, that he is a Christian, and he encourages folks to be a part of our congregation. James Duncan, if some of you have been involved with the Lord's Gym, James is the pastor or the leader of that, and exciting things I've mentioned to you a couple times are going on there. And so he's another one that I talked to on Monday, as well as the Brighton Center in our own Georgia works there. I say that to remind you that just think about the person we got connected on Monday because of our circle of influence, and the 2 people that we were able to help today. Verse 19, he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. In other words, it's a bold move because it raises the expectation. So he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke it and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples then gave it to the multitudes. And so here we find ourselves, Jesus taking action and wanting you and me to be conduits or channels through which he works. And then we'll finish it up here. The disciples distribute the bread. They all ate and were filled. And the word there, of course, tagozo that I give you there, is the word of satisfaction. How many times do we do something and we're not really satisfied? We're still just not satisfied. So the question I ask is, this kind of satisfaction suggests a God blessing rather than some sort of natural process. It is a divine rather than a human kind of enterprise. In other words, there is no way we're going to be satisfied on this side of heaven. But there is a level of peace that brings a satisfaction that, in fact, can bring some pretty good, what I would call deep-seated peace on these days. It ends simply with the 12 extra baskets, and if you know anything about the Bible, you know that the word 12 is important. You know, the 12 tribes. You know, but it literally means whole or complete. And so I did a little work on that and looked it up, and I've never heard these, but it also can reference motivation. In other words, when you're complete, your motivation is focused. The other word was achievement. I had not heard that word. It means that you have reached a level of achievement that you can, in fact, be encouraged. And so when God completes your life, there's a sense of achievement. And then finally, the other word that I'd never used before was independence. And I perceive that to be, okay, if 12 is the magic number, you know, the whole number, then it means that you can be independent from the things of this world, that they will no longer control you. There will be a level of completeness. So we are going to make that transition to our